Hi everyone, welcome to week 3, where we are continuing to discuss more about the relationship between language and Latinidad. And this week, we are starting off with a chapter from a larger work, a book called Harvest of Empire. And we are reading a chapter that has to do with the debate over the use of languages other than in English in the history of the US. So this chapter called Speak Spanish, You're in America. And I really wanted to take a couple of moments this week and zoom in on a specific quote from this chapter and think a little bit more deeply about it, how it kind of connects everything, all of the materials that we are looking at this week. So we'll start with this, and then in another short video we'll kind of expand a little bit more. And my goal for these videos is to keep it under 10 minutes, because I know it's tough to kind of sit through so many videos taking online courses. So we are going to dive right in and start with this quote from Gonzalez's chapter. He says, "The language debate is a nagging reminder that the conquest and annexation of a territory by force does not assure the assimilation of that territory's inhabitants." And I choose this quote because he's really zooming in on this relationship between language and power, and the power dynamics that kind of emerge from this initial moment of conquering, of taking over, of exerting authority over a territory or a group of people. And the lasting effects of that kind of going on into the future. And so I want to think about that in two ways. And the first way has to do really with going back. So we're going to start by going back to kind of our conversation on labels. And so I want to use this to kind of connect to what we were talking about last week, and to also highlight what I'm getting at when I'm talking about the relationship between language and power, and I want to invite us to think more deeply about that and how this is all connected as we continue this conversation this week. So to start, I want to go back to this topic of the régimen de castas. This gets mentioned in the reading from last week. It was attached to the types of labels that existed during the time period of conquest and colonization in Latin America. And what we see, and I mentioned this in our live session on Thursday, but what you see is this kind of after the Spanish Empire takes over in the Americas, and we see these hierarchies emerging where being of African descent and being indigenous are seen at the bottom of a social hierarchy, and being European is seen at the top of a social hierarchy. What happens in Latin America is the emergence kind of this scaled hierarchy based on different possible mixes of kind of different ethnicities in this kind of new in the Americas, in this new world that's created by this moment of conquering by the Spanish. So you see, for example, how, and I've put some of the labels to your right. You can see I've written them out. We're not going to go through and like analyze what all these labels mean, and what kind of, how much blood from each ethnic group each label indicates, because that's kind of a ridiculous exercise. I'm putting them here so you get an idea, a little more clear idea than you can see in the drawings on the left, because they're a little bit cloudy, but you can see how basically each drawing under it has this plus this equals this. And you can see above my video how this can end up in some very dehumanizing language. So if we have someone of African descent who produces a child with an indigenous person right above me, that combination results in under this kind of caste system that emerged in Latin America, in a someone who would be considered a lobo, which is the Spanish word for wolf. So, we see kind of this like very creaturely language emerging in a lot of cases. And so we see a way that, what I'm getting at is the way that this very elaborate system of labeling and using language to label a variety of different ethnic, racialized ethnic identities, that process of labeling itself kind of reinforces and helps to impose this hierarchy that values Europeanness at the top and kind of diminishes the importance and value of Africanness and indigeneity at the bottom. So we see the way that language has the power to actually continue to reinforce this type of social reality. And this type of this is not something that just stopped in colonial Latin America, but this is something that continues on today. We can think of how we might think about the power that labels have to reinforce certain visions of reality. Okay? And so I wanted to take a second then and connect that idea to this week's conversation, which is more about the languages that we speak, rather than the labels that we use. And I want to take us back to 1492. I think all of us, when we think about what happened in 1492, if you were educated in the United States, you might associate that year with the year that Columbus sailed the ocean blue. He gets sent out, under Spanish authority, under Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, and to explore and report back on the New World. And I mean, long story short, it doesn't go how he imagines. He thinks he finds India, etc., and he does not. The rest is a lot of the history that we're talking about this semester. But I wanted to highlight a few other things that also happened in the same exact year in Spain under the Spanish Empire. So we have this is the kind of the year that Spain really starts to exist in the way that we think of Spain today, in the sense that over many years, many hundreds of years, the Spanish Peninsula had kind of been a warring between Muslim kind of kingdoms and groups of people and Castilian and Catholic groups. And this is the year that under Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, the entire peninsula gets conquered by this Catholic king and queen, who unite the peninsula under Catholic authority. So we see religion coming into play here. We see that another sign of that as this is also the year that the Jewish people, those who refuse to convert to Catholicism, are expelled from the Spanish Peninsula. They are just flat out told, you're not welcome here because we are a Catholic empire. And so again, a cultural kind of domination thing happening in this year, as well as a connection to religion. And then the fourth thing that I wanted to highlight is this is also the year that the first grammar, official grammar of the Spanish language, in terms of a Spanish that we think of as being spoken today, this is the year that the first grammar of the Spanish language gets published by this scholar named Antonio Nebrija. And in the kind of prologue to this grammar of the Spanish language that he writes and sends to the king and queen, he says, "After your highness has subjected barbarous peoples and nations of varied tongues with conquest, will come the need for them to accept the laws that the conqueror imposes on the conquered, and among them our language. With this work of mine they will be able to learn it, as we now learn Latin from the Latin grammar." And so we see emerging from this, very initial moment of conquering in Latin America. So reaching back to that moment in terms of connection to Latinx communities, the way that language from the very beginning, with the imposition of Spanish actually, is connected to domination and conquering and the communication of laws and the imposition of a new authority. And I just think it's really interesting to highlight the kind of emergence of this grammar and this idea about language, along with the other kind of empire growing things that happened during this year. I think it gives us a really good illustration of how language becomes so closely connected to other forms of power. It becomes symbolic in a lot of ways of other expressions of power and domination on a very large scale. All right, and so one final point that I wanted to invite us to think about is the way that this same kind of attitude we see in the history of the U.S., that it gets mentioned in the Gonzalez chapter that you read. We can think about, for example, the relationship between language and assimilation of indigenous populations in the U.S. In the 1868 Indian Peace Commission report, for example, this report declares that in the difference of language today lies 2/3 of our troubles. Schools should be established which children should be required to attend, their barbarous dialects should be blotted out, and the English language substituted. And so, once again, I think it would be a good idea to note the repetition of this idea of barbarousness. So we saw that in Nebrija's grammar that I just read the quote from in the previous slide, repeated again in a different context here in the U.S., here in a commission report, used to advise the federal government about how to handle indigenous populations in the U.S., and this idea that these boarding schools should be instated to educate the children of indigenous people, and this is something that happened, and that a huge part of this education is to blot out indigenous languages and to substitute those with English as a kind of symbol of assimilation, a tool of getting of attaining assimilation of this large group of people via their children. I guess we see this kind of reinforced again in 1926 in a quote from then President Roosevelt, who says, "We have room for but one language in this country, and that is the English language, for we intend to see that the crucible turns our people out as Americans of American nationality, and not as dwellers in a polyglot boarding house." And so you see, again, this idea, this continued idea of connecting Americanness and with English, with the English language, and this idea that there's not room for other languages, and I think this all begs the question for us this week of, in what ways then, though, kind of thinking very, this is a very brief presentation But I hope I've given you some little nuggets to think about in terms of this connection between language and power, and kind of how it's connected to this history of conquering, of domination, of subduing, of some populations subduing other populations. And so I would invite you to think with me this week about in what ways is a debate about language about more than just language. So in the history of the language debate in the US that Gonzalez describes, what other agendas, beliefs, fears, and debates is the suppression of languages other than English connected to? And so that's the question right there that I'm going to invite you to answer in your group discussion this week. So you'll follow the next link on the page to get to that discussion, and there will be a couple of other requirements, but this is the question. And I will see you in another short video shortly. And I didn't make it under 10 minutes, but that will be my goal for the future. It looks like I need to have a slide or two less. Okay. See you soon.